What is up, my Squirtleites? It is I, your king, and all of the E3 conferences have concluded. The show has just begun, and it is time for me to talk about my impressions of each of the conferences over some royalty-free music for a while, not including the Nintendo Direct, because first of all, it isn't technically a conference, and second of all, I actually haven't seen that yet as of when this video is going up. I am going to be catching the Direct pretty late on Tuesday, as a matter of fact, so if I need to make a separate video for that, I will. And I kind of have a hunch that I'm going to need a separate video for it anyway, because I get the feeling Nintendo has brought more to this show than most of the other conferences combined, considering the nature of what we actually got this year. You know, there's been all this talk about how E3 is kind of on the way out, it's kind of dying, and you could definitely sort of feel that from a lot of the conferences this year. I would say Microsoft was really the only one that came to play. I mean, Square Enix was okay. But Bethesda, EA, Ubisoft, the PC Gamer Show, they were just kind of all train wrecks, and there was a lot of emphasis on mobile games throughout the show, which is just a surefire sign that, yeah, this E3 conference is just kind of falling apart, at least the actual press events themselves, as opposed to the show floor and all of that. So regardless, I'm just going to talk about each of what I think are the high points of the conferences. I've got a couple for most of the smaller conferences, and then a good chunk from the Microsoft conference to talk about. These are mostly things that I'm interested in. I should mention that, or emphasize that, I suppose, because I know not a lot of people are going to entirely agree with everything that I was excited about, because, I mean, you know, we're not always excited for the same things, obviously. But I think we can safely agree that most of us, the only thing we cared about from the EA conference was Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Now, were we actually impressed by it? That's another matter. Now, I'm willing to give the demo for that the benefit of the doubt, which is really strange to probably hear considering how much I lambast EA, but I do really like Respawn. I'm a big fan of their company. I don't think I've ever disliked a game that they've made as Respawn, or even back when they were still Infinity Ward. Like, when they were actually in charge of Infinity Ward, not current Infinity Ward. But really a big fan of Respawn, really love the stuff that they do, and so I'm willing to give this game the benefit of the doubt. I also do like that it is finally just a single-player Star Wars experience. I mean, whether or not this is just another Star Wars The Force Unleashed game, you know, that remains to be seen. It's kind of looking like that. It's not the most impressive, and the demo was kind of quiet, but like I said, again, benefit of the doubt. Perhaps they didn't really, you know, completely prepare for exactly what kind of stuff they wanted to show on the floor, and it was just a bad demo. I mean, we've seen plenty of cases for that in the past. Obviously, I'm not going to pre-order it because it's still an EA game. I'm not going to do that, or still a video game in general. You don't need to pre-order video games, but I'm willing to keep an eye on it still and not completely write it off right off the bat, because I do still think it is a game, or at least a style of game, that is worth supporting. So that was really the only takeaway I had from EA, nothing really else of substance. Microsoft, on the other hand, had quite a few things that were interesting to me. First things first was, obviously this is the thing I probably cared the most about, was Ori and the Will of the Wisps finally got a release date for February of 2020. So excited to play that game. You can bet that I'm going to be Let's Playing that game first thing here on the channel right off the bat as soon as it comes out, because I absolutely adore the first game. It is my absolute favorite platformer of all time. I should say pure platformer. I absolutely adore it. I think it's a wonderful game, and I cannot be any more excited for the sequel. But there were some other interesting things that came out of this Microsoft conference, like Keanu Reeves. That was something. Also, somebody called him magnificent. Well, he called the game magnificent, they called him magnificent, and then he called the players magnificent. It was kind of sweet and wholesome. That was for Cyberpunk, though, which I'm not going to go into because I honestly have no vested interest in that game. I know I'm like one of the only people out there that doesn't, but some of the surprises out there were Phantasy Star Online 2, which is just crazy. I know the first Phantasy Star Online, it's like one of the earliest, like, successful MMOs. I believe it was the very first MMO that actually had a run on console. And, you know, just seeing that they've actually brought back Phantasy Star Online at all is kind of insane. And it's one of those things that I feel like induced everybody into this state of shock that they don't even know what to say about it. Although I did see many jokes about being able to bring over their characters from the first game, which, I don't know, maybe they can make it happen. But yeah, Phantasy Star Online 2, that was a crazy reveal, and I'm actually kind of interested and definitely going to look at where that goes. We also saw a trailer for The Outer Worlds, which is the game that, what are they called? Obsidian is making. It's a very Fallout-esque game, and a lot of people are big fans of Fallout New Vegas from Obsidian. They think that is one of, or most people think that, I guess I shouldn't say most. There is a large subsection of players, of gamers out there who believe that Fallout New Vegas is the best 3D Fallout game ever made, and swear by it and stand by it. And seeing The Outer Worlds and seeing that the same team is behind a game that is very similar in nature, I mean, obviously with a completely its own aesthetic that's completely different in its own story and all that, but still the fact that it's a similar style, open world RPG, that's pretty cool. And I'm definitely excited for it. I'm going to keep a lookout for that because I couldn't quite get into New Vegas, but I mostly blame that on the state of the quality of the game, how old it feels, and its lack of polish, which were definitely more so down to Bethesda's issues with that game and the fact that they gave Obsidian very little time to work with that game and its other, long documented issues that it had that were on the technical end. Those are the kinds of things that turned me off from New Vegas, not the actual plot and writing and mechanics itself. So we'll be keeping an eye out for that game. Age of Empires 2 is getting a remaster. I absolutely love Age of Empires 2. It is one of my all-time favorite RTSs. I grew up playing, as far as RTSs are concerned, almost exclusively Age of Empires 2, Age of Mythology, and which is a spin-off of the Age of Empires series, and then StarCraft. Like, those are the RTSs I played by and far the most of. Oh, and I should say Warcraft 3. Tons and tons of time spent playing those games. Absolutely adore them. And seeing Age of Empires 2 coming back, I mean, I'm excited. I'm definitely going to be picking that game up pretty quickly. We also got Elden Ring, which is the next From Software game, and this is being written by George R.R. Martin, the man behind the Game of Thrones books, if you didn't already know that, which you probably all do. It looks really cool. I mean, it's interesting to see another FromSoft game in a fantasy setting. I mean, clearly it's trying to deviate a little bit more into the fantasy realm than the likes of Dark Souls and Bloodborne did. It's not, I mean, Bloodborne was eldritch. Dark Souls was just kind of just grimdark setting of like medieval times and stuff like that. I mean, it was obviously fantastical and had a lot of fantasy elements to it, but I feel like Elden Ring is going a little bit more heavy on the fantasy side of things, which is, it's neat, it's interesting. From Software games are very iffy for me because I do prefer to have my games, if they're going to be balls to the wall difficult, super hard, I tend to like faster paced action games. So I'm not a big fan of the Souls games, but I do like Bloodborne and I do like, for instance, Nioh. So that remains to be seen. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to get into it, but it's a game worth looking at. There was also this indie game that I found very interesting called Spiritfarer. It looked like it was kind of like a world-building sim / RPG. It's kind of hard to explain. Couldn't really glean too much from the trailer, but what I will say is I absolutely adored the aesthetic and the art style of it, and I think it's very intriguing. That's a game I definitely want to hear more about in the future. We also got a trailer for Microsoft Flight Simulator, which that was shocking. I don't think we've heard from that series in a very long time. I can't actually remember when the last one was made, but I feel like we haven't had one in, it's years, possibly decades. Like, it's been, I guess there were like some of like the spin-off games that we got during the mid-2000s and stuff like that, but I don't think we've had a true Microsoft Flight Simulator game since like, it's got to have been like the mid-late 2000s. So to see one with like a modern game engine, that's pretty cool. I mean, obviously these kinds of games aren't for everybody, but Microsoft Flight Simulator is one of, it's one of the most famous simulator games of all time. So to see that come back, I think it's neat. I think it's interesting, and I'm definitely going to be looking at that. Other things from the Xbox conference. There was a new Tales of game. I mean, I can't say I'm too interested in that. They're doing a full 9-pack for the Lego Star Wars series, which is cool. I mean, I think those games are great. They showed a bunch of gameplay, a lot more in-depth stuff about Psychonauts 2 in announcing that Microsoft has acquired Double Fine, which was interesting. I mean, it looks like a Psychonauts game, and I will say that's pretty promising in its own right. I mean, the first Psychonauts is an awesome game, so Psychonauts 2 has definitely been a long-anticipated, long-awaited game that I think at this point we're just ready to come out, because I think they first teased that game, 3-4 years ago? So, about time we're finally getting it. I can't wait for that one. The only other things I suppose that were of note was Microsoft announced the specs for the upcoming Xbox, which were almost exactly identical to the PlayStation 5 announced specs. So, I mean, that doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, the only thing that's been really interesting about the Xbox and the PlayStation console has been the talk of ray tracing being in the systems, which is an incredibly rare technology even in high-end PCs nowadays. So if that is a thing and these consoles are at a reasonable price, like we're talking $400 at launch, maybe $500. I think $500 would still be pushing it. But if they have all that technology and can stay within that price range, we might be talking about something interesting here, but it still seems like kind of a long shot to me at this point. But, I mean, if the Xbox and the PlayStation are just, again, exactly identical, it really is going to come down to first impressions all over again. And, you know, Xbox really can't afford to screw that up again. And PlayStation, I mean, they have a lot of leeway, but they've also gotten a really bad reputation in the past couple of years over how arrogant they've been. And the fact that they were a complete no-show this year and really don't have anything to talk about aside from, like, Ghost of Tsushima and Death Stranding. And as a result, I mean, I think they're in kind of a bad predicament as well and definitely need to step up their game if they want to retain everybody. Otherwise, everyone's just going to buy a PC and a Switch, and then we'll all be playing games that way at this rate. Although I will say, the one thing that does continuously keep me to Xbox is something that they emphasized a lot throughout this entire conference, which they did last year as well, was the Xbox Game Pass and how almost every single thing in this game is coming to Xbox Game Pass, which is awesome. I mean, I freaking love Game Pass. I think it's the best service in the gaming market at the moment. It's great subscription service with tons and tons and tons of amazing games for a pretty low cost. They talked about how they're doing an ultimate Game Pass where you get Xbox Game Pass, you get the Xbox Game Pass for PC version, which they also announced, as well as Xbox Live Gold, all for $20 a month, or I think it was $15 a month. It might have been actually $15, which is, even if it's $20, that's a phenomenal price. I'm pretty sure it was actually $15 though. Just a phenomenal price for all three of those things. I think that's really good, honestly. I mean, just Game Pass and Xbox Live Gold alone is $20 a month. So to have the PC Game Pass tacked onto that and then to chop it down another $5, that's great. Like I've said, Xbox Game Pass, that is the reason to own an Xbox, in my opinion. And, I mean, although the Game Pass service that they launched for PC does have a pretty darn good selection in its own right, but it really is one of the best subscription services around, and is definitely the best one in gaming at the moment. So I cannot... I'm not a shill for Game Pass, but I will advocate that until it gets somehow worse. And I don't put it past Microsoft, but at the moment, it's an amazing service, and I can't recommend it enough. Okay, moving on to the Bethesda conference, which it was a train wreck for the most part. Really, really bad. I mean, Bethesda's kind of in a bad situation at the moment. They kind of spent half of this conference talking about their old games and just updating games. It was really stupid, honestly. I can't believe they wasted all this show floor time for that. But there were a few new things, including one big obvious one that we all knew they were going to talk about. But the two that we weren't expecting were Ghostwire Tokyo and Deathloop. Now, I can't really say much on Ghostwire Tokyo because all we got was kind of a cinematic CGI trailer, but it's sort of pitched as some action thriller detective drama kind of thing where you're supposed to figure out what's going on with all these disappearances of people. I will say, though, the reason to watch that part of the show is because of the woman who did the presenting. Her name slips my mind, but I know she's Shinji Mikami's protege. It's like I don't actually want to pretend to know it because I've totally forgotten it. But she was darling. She was awesome. Her energy was infectious, and she was probably the most enjoyable part of this entire E3 in general thus far. Like I said, outside of the Nintendo Direct that I haven't seen, she was just a hoot and a riot, and I loved her, the way she presented it, and I loved the way she pitched it, and she probably on her own got me excited for that game. Although I will say also that being the only new release up to that point in the conference also kind of got me excited for it. So that was Ghostwire Tokyo. They also talked about a game called Deathloop, which is from Arcane. And as far as I know, Arcane has never made a bad game, ever. They've made some mediocre games like Prey, and I would even argue Dishonored is kind of mediocre, but they're still a pretty darn consistently decent studio. and they have this game that's a shooter that is basically their own version of like Edge of Tomorrow or Groundhog Day, where you have these two guys a man and a woman who keep trying to kill each other to continue a cycle of dying and waking up again, or ending the cycle. Like, that's really all we know about the objective of the game thus far, is that it's between these two badass assassins who are trying to kill each other. And like I said, I think the guy is trying to get out of the cycle, and the woman's trying to preserve the cycle of, again, dying and then living again, and then dying and living again, and just going through this over and over and over again. So pretty interesting concept, I think, for a game. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Like I said, Arcane is pretty darn consistent. I don't think we've ever seen them do a pure first-person shooter, so that'll be interesting to see as well. So I can't wait to see how that turns out. And then, of course, they ended the conference with Doom Eternal, which was the one thing people were all going into the conference with high hopes for. And I would say for the most part, it didn't disappoint. I think they kind of overdid it on the in-game sound effects a little too much. Like the Doom guy grunting when he gets hit was kind of ear-wrenching, like very quickly throughout the game. Like, I know it's trying to, take after the old Doom games. Like, this game definitely felt like it was trying even harder to lean into the arcadey feel than its predecessor. Which is fine, but also it is still a modern game, and I really don't think that, when there is these wealth of sound effects and music going on, that we also need a bunch of ear-grating sound effects added onto it. Like, it made more sense back with the original Doom, where the music was very scarce, and, really the only sound effects you were relying on were the monsters, the sounds your gun made, and the sounds the Doom guy made. So now that we have a plethora of sound effects to work with, maybe adding in all of those, ear-grating sound effects that kind of made up the whole old game isn't the best idea. They also talked about, like, some multiplayer mode that kind of seemed like whatever. I mean, Doom's multiplayer I don't think has ever been its strongest suit. There were definitely a lot of people that liked the Doom multiplayer, but I wasn't one of them personally. I just think the campaign is, like, phenomenal, and I'm hoping Doom Eternals is as well, but honestly, it didn't really do a whole lot to dissuade me. Aside from the fact that it also did look like from the trailer there were copious amounts of platforming, and Doom's not a platformer, it's a shooter, so I don't know about that, but we'll see how that turns out. There was entirely one thing from the PC Gamer Show that I found sort of interesting, and no, it wasn't Shenmue. Gosh, it wasn't Shenmue. It was this game called Chris Tales, which was like they called it like a love letter to classic JRPGs. And I can't really say a whole lot on that because the trailer didn't really say a whole lot on that. But again, another game I was just kind of intrigued by solely due to its art style and aesthetic. So if you want to know anything about that, go look up the trailer on that. Pretty interesting, I will say. Then we move on to the Ubisoft conference, which was the conference, aside from EA, I was dreading the most because I do think Ubisoft is the lowest quality AAA publisher out there. But they did win me over with one game and then got me interested looking their way with one other thing. And that first game was Watch Dogs Legion, actually. I did kind of walk away from that going, okay, all right, you've kind of got me sold on that just because the concept's kind of cool. I mean, the whole selling point of the game is the fact that you're actually building up an army. You don't have a single player protagonist this time. You actually have a ton of player protagonists, and all of them are subject to permadeath, which if they experience permadeath, you then switch to another character, and the whole point of the game is to recruit characters to make your legion stronger. And the characters can be of any age, any ethnicity, culture, background, anything like that. I mean, one of the big emphases of it was that they were literally playing as like a retired assassin who was like this 70-something-year-old grandmother, and she just kicked butt, and it was hilarious. And so that was pretty fun. I mean, it looks all right. I mean, I haven't really liked the Watch Dogs games up to this point because they do still follow the very typical stock standard Ubisoft formula that I cannot stand at this point. But I will say that the concept of Legion kind of has me intrigued enough to the point where I'll probably pick up this game when it goes on sale in the future. But I will be keeping my eye out on that. I do think that was the most promising thing of the entire conference because everything else was just so bland and and a lot of it was just updates on games that they already have out and stuff like that. And at the very end, they showed the cinematic for a game called Gods and Monsters, which is, again, it was a cinematic that sold me based entirely on its aesthetic. It's got a very, 3D cel-shaded style aesthetic, and it talks about how you are a character that slays monsters, and you help the Greek gods, and that was it. And I can't say any more on that because there's nothing else about the game that's out there, which is so weird because this is supposed to be coming out in like March of 2020 or something like that. So the fact that we aren't going to hear about anything about it again until we just get like a random trailer posted on the internet is a little bit strange to me, but it is made by, I believe, one of the more prolific Ubisoft studios, so it might be okay. It's worth keeping an eye on, I suppose. And the very last conference was, of course, the Square Enix conference, which, first things first, I just gotta say, Square Enix is so bad with their conference presentation. Like, last year's conference was, or was it last year's or was it the year before? Whichever one that they introduced the Quiet Man in, and like that's the only thing I remember of it. It was the one that was like a 20-minute like reel, and they didn't like actually have a conference. They just showed a video. It was so horrendous, and Square Enix really hasn't gotten any better with that. Like, their presentation sucks. But that's not to say they didn't show a bunch of really interesting games. Now, me personally, I'm not a huge Square Enix fan. I'm not a fan of a lot of their games, mostly because I'm not the biggest RPG fan in the world. So naturally, I don't get into a lot of Square Enix titles. But when they do make more like action-oriented games, I tend to like them. And I was interested in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which they showed a lot of, and I knew a lot of people were excited about it, and it got me pretty excited too. I am interested to see. They're doing a whole thing, though, with, like, how the game is, like, split up between two Blu-ray discs, except for one of the discs has a section where you're just in Midgard, except for that's also a standalone game. It was kind of confusing. Square Enix is very good at confusing me, just in general, with the way that they talk about things. They're very unclear a lot, and I really don't fully know how that's going to work, but that aside, the game looks phenomenal. It really does. It looks and it sounds and it phenomenal in every single way. Their rendition of the active time battle system seems pretty darn cool, even though I'm sure it's not what all Final Fantasy VII Remake enthusiasts want, but it's there. It looks pretty cool. There was a bunch of other RPG stuff that was talked about that, like, again, I'm just not a huge fan of. They did show a trailer for a game called Outrider, which is apparently by the same studio that made Bulletstorm. And I want to say good things about this game because, again, it was another one of those cinematics where the aesthetic impressed me, but I just can't tell you anything about it because, well, first of all, not only did the cinematic say nothing, but then they also had a presenter come up stage, and then they also showed another video where they were going to, like, talk about Outrider via the game director. And literally all three of these presentations, I got the vibe that this studio was so hesitant to tell us what this game actually was. Really, all that I found out about it is that it's a shooter. That's it. It's a first-person shooter again, just like Bulletstorm was. And I really can't tell you any more about it because this studio they did not seem interested in telling us what the game is about. So we'll be on the radar, but gosh dang, I can't say anything more about it other than the fact that, hey, its aesthetic was cool. And then at the very end of the show, they did talk about Avengers, and yeah, it looks pretty darn awesome. Although I will say, the disconnect that I got just hearing these completely different voices coming out of these characters that look incredibly similar, or are at least meant to look very similar for the most part to the movie counterparts, especially Bruce Banner. Like, the Hulk was absolutely supposed to look exactly like the movie counterpart, and hearing all those voices with those faces, there was a strange disconnect, and it felt very weird. Like, Nolan North's voice coming out of Iron Man's suit, I couldn't get over that. I really could not get over that. But, I mean, I'm sure I will. It was just very strange. But that was the only thing, like, from the trailer that I guess wasn't necessarily a positive. It looks good. It looks interesting. It looks like a fun game. I'm always down for a good superhero video game. I mean, when they're good, there's some of the most fun games out there. So that's going to be coming later in 2020. And they also talked about how, oh yeah, no loot boxes, by the way, because, they got to reassure us about that stuff, and how all content coming after launch will be free. So all that stuff is pretty darn cool. Those were really all the highlights I had for E3 between all the conferences. And look, this video is now at 25 minutes. I mean, not a whole lot to talk about. between 6 different conferences. And I mean, yeah, I gotta say, like, I'm definitely getting that vibe that E3 is on the way out. It's kind of dying. It's losing its luster because, I mean, for crying out loud, Bethesda especially, but then, you know, even Ubisoft had a part in it, or Square Enix, excuse me, and EA. I mean, they just, freaking heck, companies just really hammered home the mobile games this year. And even when they weren't hammering the mobile games down, they didn't really have a whole lot to say on new games outside of the Xbox conference. Like I said, it felt like all the third-party games were crammed into the Xbox conference, and then they had a few exclusives, and the rest of them had like 1 or 2 exclusives that were worth getting excited about. And then everything else was just kind of, like it was really kind of bland this year. I mean, when Square Enix is your second best conference, when given the past they have almost always had the worst conference, that tells you about where E3 has gone at this point. So yeah, that's really all I have to say on that matter. If I have to make an entire video dedicated to the Nintendo Direct, I will. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.